the elite, they get discount of like 3% discount.
She was the face before the supermodel era even had a name. A girl from Philadelphia who became the obsession of the world's most iconic designers Dior, Armani, Versace. At just 18, she was everywhere, fronting covers, owning the runway, radiating a magnetic beauty that felt both tough and fragile. She didn't just model clothes, she devoured the lens. She didn't walk into a room, she exploded into it. But the same fire that made Gia Carangi unforgettable also consumed her. She wasn't built for the glittering machinery of fashion, not really. She was raw, impulsive, openly emotional in a world that demanded detachment. Her defiance made her iconic. Her vulnerability made her doomed. In just a few short years, Gia went from being the next big thing to being the tragic, cautionary tale whispered behind the scenes. Her descent was fast and brutal. Heroin, rehab, rejection. Then came the final cruelty, a diagnosis of AIDS, when the disease was still misunderstood and feared. She died in 1986, at just 26 years old, abandoned by the industry she helped build, buried without headlines, without flowers, without justice. But the legend never died. Decades later, Gia remains one of the most haunting names in fashion. A woman who burned too bright, too fast, and left behind a ghost that still lingers on every catwalk. This is not just a story of beauty. It's a story of loss, betrayal, brilliance, and utter devastation. The tragedy of Gia Carangi. Gia Marie Carangi was born on the 29th of January, 1960, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a city known for grit, not glamour. Her father, Joseph, owned a small chain of sandwich shops. Her mother, Kathleen, was a homemaker with a wild streak. From the start, Gia's world was unsteady. The household was loud, erratic, and often filled with tension. When Gia was just 11, her mother walked out, leaving the young girl behind in a fractured family that never quite healed. That wound, maternal abandonment, would follow her like a shadow. Growing up, Gia was a tomboy. She wasn't the polished beauty people would later see on magazine covers. She was moody, impulsive, intense. But she also had a kind of presence, a magnetism that drew people in. In high school, she fell into a circle known as the Bowie Kids, a group of outsiders who idolized David Bowie and played with androgyny, fashion, and rebellion. Gia embraced the fluid identity, dyeing her hair, wearing leather, and questioning conventions. She was openly attracted to women, even as the world around her tried to box her in. Gia's early life was marked by two competing forces, a desperate craving for love and an instinctive distrust of it. Her mother's departure left her constantly seeking validation, while her father's emotionally distant nature offered little solace. Teachers noted her volatility. She could be sweet one moment, explosive the next. What Gia needed was grounding. What she got instead was escape. That escape came in the form of a camera lens. At 17, she moved to New York City with stars in her eyes and chaos in her heart. She was chasing something: belonging, beauty, maybe even revenge on a world that had abandoned her so early. Her mother had re-entered her life by then, but the damage had been done. Gia's vulnerability wasn't hidden. It was exposed, raw, and often overwhelming. That fragility, though, would become her signature. Photographer Francesco Scavullo once described Gia as pure emotion. She didn't pose, she existed in front of the camera. And that vulnerability, born from childhood scars, made her unforgettable. The fashion world didn't just want Gia's face. It wanted her soul, and she gave it freely, at least at first. But beneath that early rise was a storm still brewing. Gia's adolescence laid the groundwork for everything that came later. The hunger for connection, the battles with addiction, the inability to say no, and the heartbreaking pattern of falling for people who couldn't or wouldn't save her. In many ways, she was still that little girl waiting at the window for a mother who never came back, and that longing would become the silent undertow of her entire life. Gia's entrance into the modeling world was nothing short of electric. She arrived in New York in 1977, barely 17, wild-eyed, with a body built for high fashion and a face that didn't just look good in photos, it demanded them. She wasn't classically beautiful in the stiff, icy way fashion often preferred. She was feral, emotionally unfiltered, unpredictable, and that's exactly what made her unforgettable. Her first big break came through Wilhelmina Cooper, the former model-turned-agency head who instantly saw something rare in the young rebel. Wilhelmina became more than a manager. She was a surrogate mother, a steadying force. Gia, who'd been aching for maternal protection, clung to her. Under Wilhelmina's wing, Gia's career skyrocketed. Her earliest test shots stunned photographers. Her presence was magnetic. She didn't follow the traditional poses. She felt her way through shoots. "You didn't need to direct Gia," said Chris von Wangenheim, one of the first high-fashion photographers to work with her. "You just needed to let her move." He would later shoot her in a now infamous nude campaign, stark, confident, brazen. It was clear, this was no ordinary girl from Philly. By 1978, Gia was working with the world's biggest names: Richard Avedon, Arthur Elgort, Helmut Newton. Her image graced the pages of Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's Bazaar. She modeled for Dior, Versace, Armani, and Yves Saint Laurent, all before turning 20. She could shift from punk to couture in a single frame. Her androgyny, paired with sensuality, was revolutionary. Designers couldn't get enough of her. Photographers were obsessed. Stylists built entire looks around her face. Gia wasn't just wearing the clothes, she was the moment. But what people didn't see was that her rise was already tinged with instability. Behind the scenes, Gia struggled with the sudden attention. The parties were constant, the drugs easy, and the boundaries blurred. She was often seen out at Studio 54, tangled in the excess of the late 70s second fashion elite. She started dabbling in cocaine, then heroin. At first, it was recreational the way it was for many in the scene. But for Gia, it filled a deeper void. It quieted the noise, numbed the pain, filled the silence left by love that had never arrived. Wilhelmina Cooper, sensing Gia's growing recklessness, tried to intervene, but in 1980, just as Gia's star was cementing, Wilhelmina died suddenly of lung cancer. Gia was devastated. The woman she saw as her last lifeline was gone. She spiraled, and the cracks began to show. She missed calls, skipped shoots, showed up high. Agencies warned her. Editors grew wary. But the camera never betrayed her. Even in chaos, Gia delivered gold until she didn't never. And that would mark the beginning of a slow, brutal unraveling. For now, though, Gia was still at the top. The it girl, the future, the face of a new era in modeling, one that would burn out long before it ever had the chance to grow old. From 1979 to 1980, Gia Carangi stood at the absolute peak of the modeling world. In an industry infamous for chewing up and spitting out new faces, Gia didn't just survive, she dominated. She was the fashion world's obsession, the embodiment of raw energy, androgynous elegance, and reckless glamour. No other model captured the edge between vulnerability and power the way Gia did. She wasn't just another pretty face, she was a force of nature. At the height of her career, Gia landed multiple Vogue covers, a coup reserved for the untouchable elite. She walked for Versace, posed in sharp silhouettes for Armani, seduced the lens for Helmut Newton, and became the face of Dior's most prestigious campaigns. In the era before supermodels were household names, Gia was the anomaly, a model so magnetic that fashion magazines didn't need to introduce her. One look at those fierce, haunted eyes, and you remembered. But unlike the polished, guarded stars that would follow her, Cindy, Linda, Naomi, Gia never played by the rules. She didn't want to smile, she didn't want to conform, and she didn't want to be told how to behave. That wild streak only made her more appealing. Photographers adored her unfiltered energy. Stylists praised her fearlessness. She would walk into a studio late barefoot and still produce magic that others couldn't even fake. One iconic shoot for Versace captured Gia in a sleek black dress, eyes dark with eyeliner, body poised like a jungle cat. Another for Cosmopolitan showed her sun-kissed and laughing, the illusion of a carefree youth masking the chaos within. Her image was everywhere: bus stops, billboards, magazine racks. Everyone wanted a piece of her, and for a while, Gia gave it. In interviews, she seemed detached, often distracted, sometimes flirtatious. She hated talking about herself. When asked about her success, she once shrugged and said, "I don't know, maybe they just like me." But those close to her knew the truth. Gia was overwhelmed. She felt out of place in the world of air kisses and backstabbing. She was too honest, too sensitive, too real. Yet, she carried on, gracing cover after cover, still pulling in tens of thousands of dollars per campaign. She had it, all the money, the fame, the lovers, the parties. She dated both men and women openly, including a torrid and complicated relationship with makeup artist Sandy Linter, a woman she loved deeply and destructively. But even as Gia's star blazed, the seeds of her fall were already sown. She was using heroin regularly, sometimes even during shoots. Some photographers turned a blind eye, others tried to protect her. But there were rumors about the track marks, the missed bookings, the fights, the self-destruction. The industry, ever hungry for the next girl, began to whisper. Still, in those brief, shining years, Gia defined what it meant to be a modern supermodel before the term even existed. She wasn't just part of fashion, she changed it. She made it wild, dangerous, and deeply human. This was Gia at her most powerful. But the higher the ascent, the more fatal the fall. Gia Carangi wasn't just a model, she was a revolution in heels. In an industry obsessed with perfection, control, and composure, Gia shattered the mold. She brought chaos to the catwalk, poetry to the pose, and truth to a world built on artifice. Her rebellion wasn't loud, it was effortless. She didn't try to be different, she just was. At a time when most models followed strict routines, wore what they were told, and smiled on cue, Gia showed up in ripped jeans, no makeup, and a cigarette dangling from her lips. She didn't care about being polished. She cared about being real. And paradoxically, that raw authenticity became her power. She was openly queer in an era where few dared to be. Her relationship with Sandy Linter, though never fully labeled, was no secret among fashion insiders. Gia made no apologies. She flirted with both men and women, never asking permission. She once showed up to a party in a man's tuxedo with no shirt underneath, leaving the room breathless. While other models played by the book, Gia rewrote the script. She refused to play the industry's version of lady. She cursed in interviews, walked out of shoots if she felt uncomfortable, and called out photographers who tried to control her. She challenged the myth of the obedient muse. Gia didn't just model clothes, she made them bend to her will. One infamous photo session with Chris von Wangenheim required her to pose naked behind a chain-link fence with wild dogs snarling at her. Another with Scavullo had her bare, vulnerable, and defiant scars visible, nothing hidden. Gia didn't flinch. She used her body as protest, her gaze as a weapon. She was saying, "You want beauty? Then look at the whole of me, not just the surface." And yet, her rebellion wasn't just public. It was deeply personal. Gia had always hated the hypocrisy of the fashion world, how it praised individuality while punishing it behind closed doors. She resented the superficiality, the backstabbing, the way love came with conditions. She longed for something deeper, something true, but all she found were blurred lines and broken promises. She rebelled with heroin. She rebelled with sex. She rebelled by showing up late or not at all. Her resistance wasn't glamorous, it was tragic. A cry for help the world mistook for attitude. But perhaps the cruelest irony is this: the very industry that cheered her wildness never intended to protect her from it. Fashion wanted Gia's fire, but not her fury. It loved her rebellion, but not her breakdown. She was profitable as an icon, disposable as a person. Still, Gia's defiance left a mark. She opened doors for models who would later be bold, sexual, and real on their own terms. She showed the world that a supermodel could be damaged, queer, chaotic, and still utterly transcendent. She didn't just break the rules. She burned the playbook, and the ashes she left behind would haunt the industry for decades to come. By 1981, Gia Carangi, the once unstoppable force of fashion, was spiraling out of control. The signs had been there for months. Erratic behavior, bruises masked with makeup, missed shoots, broken contracts. Her addiction to heroin was no longer whispered about, it was visible, undeniable, and career-ending. The industry that once worshipped her began to quietly turn its back. Her photo sessions became chaotic. She would nod off during makeup. One minute she was radiant, the next she was curled up in a corner, withdrawn and unreachable. She began arriving late, or not at all. Some photographers tried to help. Others simply blacklisted her. Clients canceled contracts. Editors moved on. The girl who had once been everywhere was now disappearing from the very pages she helped define. Gia's world narrowed. The parties stopped. The cameras dimmed. By 1982, she had dropped off the radar entirely. She returned to Philadelphia, her hometown, broke and emotionally wrecked. Her family, especially her mother Kathleen, tried to intervene, but years of abandonment and trauma had built walls even love couldn't climb. In a desperate attempt to rebuild her life, Gia entered rehabilitation. She checked into multiple programs, including Eagleville Hospital, where she underwent methadone treatment. For a while, there were signs of hope. She stayed clean, took up photography classes, even tried working at a jeans store. She wanted to get better, but the damage ran deep. Every time she reached for a new beginning, the past pulled her back down. She tried to return to modeling briefly in the early 1982nd, but the magic was gone. The industry had moved on to newer, safer faces. Gia, once their muse, had become a liability. Even her old allies, like Francesco Scavullo, couldn't convince editors to take another chance. She was 23 and already washed up. Then came the final blow, one even Gia couldn't fight. In 1985, she was diagnosed with AIDS. It was a death sentence. The epidemic was still misunderstood, stigmatized, and cruelly sensationalized. As one of the first high-profile women to contract HIV, Gia became a pariah. No one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to help. Fashion, which had once commodified her beauty, now recoiled in silence. She spent her final days at Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia, isolated in the men's ward because there was no place for women with AIDS. She was thin, sickly, forgotten. The model who had once graced the covers of Vogue and strutted down catwalks now lay in a sterile hospital room, alone except for a few family members and friends. On the 18th of November, 1986, Gia Carangi died. She was just 26 years old. There was no major obituary, no front-page memorial, no tribute from the industry she once defined. She died anonymously, buried in a small cemetery outside Philadelphia. No flowers from Vogue, no mention from the runways she once ruled. It was as if fashion had erased her, as if her downfall had made her inconvenient to remember. But her story didn't stay buried. In the years that followed, whispers turned to questions, and questions became legacy. Books were written, documentaries were made. Angelina Jolie's portrayal of Gia in the 1998 HBO film brought her name back into the conversation. And finally, the world began to reckon with what it had lost. Gia wasn't just a tragedy. She was a reckoning. Gia Carangi's legacy isn't just preserved in photographs. It lingers like smoke in the halls of fashion history. She wasn't around long enough to see the term supermodel become mainstream. But if anyone deserved that title first, it was her. Long before Cindy, Naomi, or Linda, Gia had already defined what it meant to be iconic, not just beautiful, but unforgettable. She was the prototype, raw, flawed, magnetic, and undeniably real. Though the industry discarded her in life, it could never fully erase her impact. She became a cult figure, the beautiful ruin everyone whispered about. Models who came after her cited her as an influence. Photographers revisited her shoots as gold standards of emotional intensity. And in a time when AIDS was still cloaked in stigma, Gia became one of its first female public faces, forcing the fashion world to confront the consequences of its silence. The 1998 HBO film Gia, starring Angelina Jolie, reignited interest in her life and tragedy. It didn't just dramatize her story, it validated it. For many, it was the first time they learned her name. For others, it was the long overdue tribute she never received while alive. Today, Gia is remembered not only for her beauty, but for the pain she carried so openly. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't polished, but she was real in a way that few in her world dared to be. And that's why her story still matters. Because beyond the fashion, beyond the photos, beyond the fall, Gia Carangi was a girl who loved too hard, hurt too deep, and flew too close to the flame. And in doing so, she became eternal.